morning to everyone tuning in for the talk this morning. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Today we're going to hear from Mr. David Sloss, who is the John A. and Elizabeth H. Sutro Professor of Law at Santa Clara University School of Law. His CGSR lecture this morning is titled Tyrants on Twitter, Protecting Democracies from Information Warfare. And this talk shares its title with his new book from Stanford University Press, which is coming out this month in April 2022. The book is the first detailed analysis of how Chinese and Russian agents weaponize Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube to subvert the liberal international order. And in addition to examining the 2016 U.S. election, as you would expect in a book with that title, David explores Russia's use of foreign influence operations to threaten democracies in Europe, which again is a very timely topic, as we just had the French elections here recently for the opening round, as well as China's use of social media and other digital tools to meddle in Western democracies and buttress autocratic rulers around the world. The solution, as I'm sure David will outline a little bit in his talk, is for cooperation among democratic governments to create a new transnational system for regulating social media to protect Western democracies from information warfare. And drawing on his professional experience as an arms control negotiator, David's book is going to outline a novel system of transnational governance that Western democracies can enforce by harmonizing their domestic regulations. And I think most importantly, as anyone who follows U.S. domestic politics will understand, he's going to explain why that system, if implemented by legislation in the United States, would be constitutionally defensible, despite likely First Amendment objections. And all of this, an exploration of the problem and the enumeration of a possible solution, I think will be enormously valuable to those here at the lab who are exploring information warfare in particular, and also sort of strategic competition with Russia and China more broadly. So let me just say a little bit about the speaker. As I mentioned, David is the John A. and Elizabeth H. Sutro Professor of Law at Santa Clara University. In addition to this recent book that he's just published, he's the author of The Death of Treaty Supremacy, An Invisible Constitutional Change. It came out from Oxford University Press in 2016. He's published several dozen book chapters and law review articles. His book that I just mentioned on the death of treaty supremacy and the edited volume on international law in the U.S. Supreme Court both won prestigious book awards from the American Society of International Law. He's also a professor of the American Law Institute and a counselor to the American Society of International Law. The ground rules, for those of you who don't often attend these talks, David's going to deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor up for discussion. Please feel free at any point to get your hand up electronically. Please submit your questions to me in the chat function, and that way when the remarks are concluded, we can get the discussion rolling quickly and get as many of your questions and comments as possible in the time allotted. David, thank you again so much for being with us. Over to you for your remarks. I'm just going to go ahead and put the link to your book here now in the chat so people can take a look at it as you're speaking. So thank you again.
All right, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I actually worked at Lawrence Livermore Labs one summer almost 30 years ago, and I haven't been back to the lab in a long time. So it's nice to be here and get a chance to talk to this group. I'm going to just pull up my slides here, if I can. Give me a second here to figure out how to do that. Okay. So as Michael mentioned, I'm talking about my new book, Tyrants on Twitter, Protecting Democracies from Information Warfare. There's a copy of the cover there, and the book is now out and available. Interestingly, the publication date is April 12th, which is tomorrow. When I asked the publisher, well, what does that mean, the publication date? They said that's the date it's available on Amazon. So apparently the publication industry has changed a little bit over the last couple of decades. Anyway, so my central argument I'll sort of summarize briefly here. I start with the premise that we're in a new Cold War with China. I think that term Cold War means different things to different people. In saying that, I do not mean to imply that this is a sort of a battle to the death where one will survive and the other will fail. What I mean more is that we're in for a long-term geopolitical competition with China as the primary adversary, although obviously these days China and Russia are closely linked, and Russia is an important competitor too. They're getting more attention since the invasion of Ukraine, although I think most people agree that China is the more significant sort of long-term threat. Uh, we're going to compete with China in three areas: military, economic, and information competition. I think information competition has assumed a greater importance in the current environment than it did in the Cold War with Russia or with the Soviet Union. For a couple of different reasons. One is obviously just changes in information technology mean that information technology is more pervasive and far reaching than it was when the last Cold War ended 30 years ago. But the other big reason here is that we effectively won the Cold War with the Soviet Union through beating them economically. At least in the near term, it doesn't look like we're going to beat China economically. They're a much more formidable economic competitor. But as with the last Cold War, we have a strong incentive of avoiding direct military competition. So if we want to avoid direct military conflict, and we're unlikely to defeat China economically or outperform China economically in the near term, information competition takes on a real premium. I argue in the book that right now we're effectively subsidizing Chinese and Russian information warfare on social media by granting Chinese and Russian agents effectively unrestricted access to major social media platforms. And I think this is a big mistake. Uh, so I argue that Chinese and Russian information warfare poses a significant threat to Western democracies, and that this is a major factor contributing to the problem of democratic decay. I'll come back in just a few minutes and say a little bit more about what I mean by the problem of democratic decay. And so my basic proposal is that we need to regulate social media to protect democracies. In particular, we need regulatory harmonization among leading Western democracies so that basically the leading democratic countries adopt parallel domestic regulations to deal with social media in a way that's specifically designed to limit the influence of Chinese and Russian agents on social media. And the centerpiece of my proposal, which I know is controversial and I'm sure people will have questions about, is to essentially ban Chinese and Russian state agents from social media platforms. More broadly, I think that we ought to conceive of the power to regulate the information space as a strategic asset. Right now, we're squandering that strategic asset by essentially leaving the information space largely unregulated. And as I said, I think that is a mistake that we correct. So let me start here with a sort of a picture of how the balance between democracies and autocracies has changed over time. So the first graph here shows the sort of early period of the post-Cold War era. It goes from, I don't know, the print there may be a little small to read, but it goes from 1990 until 2006. And the basic picture there shows that the percentage of autocratic states or authoritarian states in the world decreased dramatically during this period from about, we went from 1990, about half the states in the world were autocracies. By 2006, that was down to a quarter. Meanwhile, during that same period, the percentage of democratic states in the world increased from just 25% to about 35%. So this was a period of, widespread optimism that we were on a historical path where democracies were gaining strength, autocracies were failing. Unfortunately, those trends have been reversed over the last 10 or 15 years. So this shows the time period from 2005 to 2019. Sorry, but 2019 was the last data I had when I, put this together for the book. And so the decline in autocracy sort of bottomed out in around 2011 at about 22% of the states in the world. Then it started increasing steadily after that, up to 26% in 2019, and that trend has continued since then. Meanwhile, the percentage of democratic states sort of peaked somewhere in there between 2005 and 2009. Since 2009, that percentage has been declining from, on this graph, 34% to 30%. So I think these trends are troubling for those of us who, believe that democracy is a good thing. We should be really worried about these trends of sort of rising autocracies and declining democracies. And I think that information warfare is contributing to these trends, and in particular, the use of social media to conduct information warfare. So this Venn diagram shows what I mean when I talk about information warfare. There are lots of different possible definitions out there, but I see information warfare lying at the intersection between two other phenomena. So one of those phenomena, foreign influence operations, is something that states have been doing for centuries. This is just essentially foreign influence operations is what one state does to meddle in the domestic politics or governance of another state. States have been doing that, as I said, for centuries, and there's nothing new about that. What is new is organized social media manipulation. Organized social media manipulation is essentially the use of social media by political parties or governments to achieve political objectives. And much of that is purely domestic, right? I mean, here in the United States, we know that both Democratic candidates and Republican candidates have used social media to bolster their political campaigns. That is organized social media manipulation. What's slightly less common, but becoming more common, is using social media strategically to pursue foreign policy goals or to influence domestic policy or governance in other countries. And that's really what I'm talking about with information warfare. That lies at the intersection between organized social media manipulation and foreign influence operations. So I want to talk a little bit now about Russian and Chinese information warfare tactics. There's a line that I really like that comes from someone who served on the National Security Council under President Trump, who said that Russia is a hurricane and China is climate change. And I think that's a good description of how they go about pursuing their information warfare activities. So Russia's information warfare activities are primarily negative and destructive. Russia has been trying to undermine the European Union, undermine NATO, and generally undermine liberal democracy. So its goals are basically, as I said, negative and destructive. In contrast, China has a more sort of positive vision of how it would like to reshape the international order. China is essentially trying to move the international order in a direction that is less consistent with liberal values, more consistent with its illiberal authoritarian values. And social media is really, for China, a relatively small piece of a much bigger information strategy or information operations strategy. So China's taking a long view here. It's not in a hurry to sort of achieve this goal, but it is looking sort of systematically at how to shape the global information environment in a way that, if you will make the world safe for autocracy. Okay, so now maybe a little more specifics on China and Russia individually. So Russian interference in the 2016 US election is quite well known. Robert Mueller, in his detailed report that he prepared as special counsel, characterized Russian activity as sweeping and systematic. And I think that is a fair characterization. Russian interference in the 2016 US election was really quite far reaching, involved a number of different elements, but social media manipulation was part of that broader strategy. And I maintain that Russia may actually have swung the outcome in favor of Donald Trump in 2016. Now, we can't say that for sure, but the most systematic study of this was done by a professor at University of Pennsylvania, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, and she published a book a couple of years ago called Cyber War. She is a scholar of political communication, so she really looks in detail in that book at how Russian interference shaped the environment of political communications leading up to the 2016 election. And she makes, in my view, a fairly convincing argument that if you focus specifically on the three swing states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that Russian interference, I'd say for sure, but it is a plausible argument that Russian interference might have made the difference in those three states, all of which were decided by very narrow margins. But even if Russia didn't swing the election, Russia certainly contributed to what has become a very sort of toxic and polarized political atmosphere in the United States, which I think itself is a significant threat to the vitality of US democracy. And that is an ongoing problem. Now, I also document in the book that Russia has interfered in at least 20 other countries in Europe that are members of either the European Union or NATO or both since 2014. Its goal has been primarily to weaken both NATO and the European Union. And it has pursued that goal in part by bolstering far-right parties in countries in both the EU and NATO. And in fact, we've seen a tremendous growth of those far-right parties in Europe since, well, let's say over the past decade or so. And in general, the far-right parties in Europe are skeptical about both NATO and the European Union. And I think the rise of the far right in Europe presents a real threat to the liberal international order generally and to the continued viability of democracies or liberal democracies in Europe. And in fact, the recent elections in France, just on, I believe it was yesterday, Marine Le Pen, if you look back over Marine Le Pen's performance in France over the last series of elections, she keeps getting more and more, a higher percentage of the vote each time, every 4 years as they have new elections in France. And there's some chance she could actually win in the runoff with Macron in the upcoming runoff election in France. And her performance in France is, you know, typical of what's been going on in a number of other European countries. And Russia has actually played an important role here in bolstering the far right in Europe, partly through messaging on social media, partly through financing those far right parties in Europe. Okay, moving on now to China. Um, this chart shows you 5 major state-run Chinese media companies and compares them to US media companies. And this is the number of likes on Facebook. So how many people there are on Facebook who are basically paying attention to these outlets. And you can see here that the top 5 Chinese media companies all outperform CNN, which is the highest ranked US media company, on Facebook. And those figures are actually pretty startling because almost all of those like Facebook are from people out for the Chinese companies, people outside of China, since Facebook is banned within China. So China is reaching, or Chinese state media companies are reaching a huge global audience on Facebook, much more so than US media companies are. And the Facebook presence of these companies is only one piece of what they're doing. China has spent billions of dollars over the last decade establishing these companies as a major presence on both television and radio in countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So there are actually now a large number of countries in the global south where Chinese state media companies are some of the biggest companies in the television and radio environment in those places, as well as reaching people there on Facebook. So they are really influencing the perceptions of people in dozens of countries around the world about international affairs. And one indicator of this is you look at there was a recent vote in the UN General Assembly to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That resolution passed, but it only passed because a whole lot of countries either abstained or chose not to vote. And I think a lot of those countries so there were 193 potential votes. There were 93 votes in favor, so that's a little less than half. But all those other countries that are abstaining or choosing not to vote, a lot of them are places where the views of international affairs are being shaped to a large extent by these large global Chinese media companies, who I think are having a significant influence on perceptions around the world. They also, by the way, put out a lot of propaganda on COVID to try and, paint themselves as the good guys in the whole COVID campaign. And I think that had some impact too. One other kind of thing that China's doing that is particularly troubling is using WeChat to influence what's going on in Western democracies. So, as I suspect many of you know, WeChat is the largest Chinese social media platform, but it's not just a social media platform. Within China, you can think about WeChat as sort of Facebook and Amazon rolled into one, right? It is a shopping platform as well as a social media platform. WeChat also has a very large presence outside of China, particularly in ethnic Chinese communities around the world. So WeChat, the last numbers I have, has about 240 million users outside of China. Many of those WeChat users outside of China are in Western liberal democracies, places with big ethnic Chinese communities like Australia, Canada, England, the United States. WeChat, what started to happen because you have large numbers of ethnic Chinese in these Western liberal democracies, politicians in these countries are using WeChat to communicate with their ethnic Chinese constituents. The problem with this is that WeChat actually, or China, I should say, but China through WeChat controls communications on those platforms. And China domestically has developed a system for essentially using electronic communications for surveillance, censorship, and control. And they've started to extend the systems of surveillance and censorship to communications between Western politicians and their ethnic Chinese constituents, insofar as those politicians are using WeChat to communicate with those constituents. So this is a pretty troubling evidence of, Chinese intervention in the sort of ordinary day-to-day political communications between Western politicians and their constituents by sort of controlling what happens on that WeChat platform. So turning more to a big picture here, I think a key point to understand is that information warfare as it exists today is very asymmetric, right? Russia and China can exploit information warfare, again, particularly the use of social media, both to undermine democracy in existing democratic countries and to promote autocracy in countries that are sometimes referred to as hybrid states, those that are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic, but China uses information technology to essentially push them further in the autocratic direction. There was a very good article in Foreign Affairs 2 or 3 years ago about digital dictators. And it looks at how the widespread use of digital technology is generally being used in autocratic states to strengthen government control over the population. And China is very much facilitating this trend. And the authors of that article had good empirical evidence to show that once you start introducing widespread use of digital technology in countries that are authoritarian or leaning authoritarian, it tends to strengthen autocratic control in those countries, make it harder to organize sort of anti-government, pro-democratic protests. And China, through export of digital technology, is generally supporting that trend. Uh, so, unfortunately, we cannot do to Russia and China what they do to us. And there are two reasons for that. One is that they have closed information environments. The Russian information environment has just become a whole lot more closed since the invasion of Ukraine. They're starting, but it used to be before the invasion of Ukraine, you could actually use, or we in the West could use social media to reach a pretty large audience within Russia. We couldn't do it in China because of the Great Firewall of China, but we could reach a lot of people within Russia. Russia has now shut down most of that, so it's become much harder to reach people there. And even if we could use social media to reach, the general populace in Russia and China, we really can't use it to influence elections because they don't have free and fair elections. So, at least in the realm of social media, there's not much that we can do offensively to sort of rectify this imbalance. So I think we need to have much better defenses against Chinese and Russian information warfare. And so that leads to my policy proposal, which I'm now going to turn to. So one of the key goals of my policy proposal is, and here I really am using sort of military jargon, to shift the attack defense ratio. One of the key things that Russia did in the 2016 election, which was very effective, is they set up a whole lot of fake accounts on social media, where essentially Russian agents were posing as ordinary US citizens. And it's very easy to do that on social media. And in general, under the current system, the way we have it structured, these foreign agents can create 10 new fake accounts in less time and for less cost than it takes for companies to block even one fake account. So that's not a very favorable ratio for the defenders. So part of my proposal here is designed to shift the attack defense ratio, make it much more costly and time consuming for foreign agents to create new fake accounts, make it much cheaper and easier to detect and block those fake accounts. We can't make it impossible for them, but I think we can actually make it sufficiently costly and difficult that they have to start pursuing other strategies to get around that. So here's a brief summary of my proposal, my regulatory proposal. Starts with creating a new international organization, an alliance for democracy, that would be composed of about 35 to 40 states that have strong credentials as liberal democracies and that also have clean governments. We don't have problems of government corruption. And I can say more in a little bit about why that's important. This system would essentially preserve unrestricted free speech on social media for citizens and nationals of alliance member states. However, it would ban Chinese and Russian state agents from major social media platforms, with a possible exemption for agents who are determined to be benign state agents. And I can come back and say a little more later about, or maybe in the Q&A, about how to implement that. I think it's complicated to implement it, but I have ideas about how it could be implemented effectively. Um, then I would have disclaimer rules, that is warnings when basically a citizen of a non-member state is commenting on elections in a member state. So just to sort of explain that point a little bit, let's assume that Venezuela is not a member of the Alliance for Democracy, but Venezuela wouldn't be subject to the same ban that applies to Chinese and Russian agents. So somebody who is a Venezuelan citizen wants to post stuff on social media commenting on an upcoming election in, say, Canada, which is a member of Alliance. They would be allowed to comment on social media on elections in Canada, but the social media companies would have to include in that message a disclaimer that says something like, this message is being posted by someone who is a citizen or national of a non-democratic state, so that Canadian citizens would at least know that they might sort of take this message with a grain of salt, whatever it's saying. All right, I would also establish a social media registration system. I'll come back and say more about that social media registration system in a minute, but there would be rigorous safeguards to protect both informational privacy and data security. All right, so the registration system would essentially require everybody who has a public account on social media to register that account essentially with the social media company, but also with their home governments. People could avoid the registration requirement by signing up for a private account rather than a public account. Those private accounts, they would be limited in terms of the number of people they could reach directly on social media. Those who sign up for public accounts would have to declare their nationality and certain other identifying information. That, excuse me, identifying information would be shared with their home government. So I sign up for an account on Facebook. I would declare myself as a US citizen. I would provide certain identifying information. Facebook would share that information with the United States government, and the United States government would essentially check to see that, yes, in fact, there is a US citizen named David Sloss whose identifying information matches the declared identifying information. So the declaration is true and accurate. This would involve coordination with other members of the alliance. So if I declare somebody registers as a French national, Facebook is going to have to coordinate with the French government. They register as a Canadian national, Facebook is going to have to coordinate with the Canadian government. But the basic idea here is to make sure that this makes it almost impossible to create what I call fictitious user accounts. I actually distinguish in the book among several different kinds of fake accounts, but a fictitious user account is an account in which I register as essentially a non-existent person, right? The registration system will make it impossible to register as a national of an alliance member state as a non-existent person. Um, all right. So looking broadly at the sort of costs and benefits of this system, and again, I can go into more details about the registration system and about implementing the ban and some of those kinds of things during the question and answers. Um, the main tactical benefit is it's going to make it much more costly and time consuming for foreign agents to create fake accounts. It doesn't make it impossible, but by making it more costly and time consuming, that uh, helps shift the attack defense ratio. Um, also should help limit the spread of propaganda and disinformation on social media, at least propaganda and disinformation coming from Russian and Chinese nationals. And the big goal here is to help halt or reverse this process of democratic decay. And I think a well implemented system here could, it's not going to single handedly do that, but it can help contribute to that broader strategic goal. There are undoubtedly some costs involved with my proposal. There are administrative costs and burdens, primarily for social media companies and also secondarily for governments. I think one of the big concerns about the registration system is it will end up impacting both privacy and anonymity. And this has been a big concern that's been raised with me. I've actually designed the system in a way in which it, I think, provides complete protection for anonymity, allows people to appear anonymously on social media. Again, I can say a little bit more about that in the Q&A. And I think leads to essentially the same level of protection for privacy as we've got now. Probably not going to improve that, but I don't think it's going to make it worse. I think the system could potentially have a chilling effect on free speech. That definitely is a First Amendment concern. And again, I'm happy to say a little bit more about the First Amendment issues here in the question and answer. That's going to depend a lot on the rollout, right? So the more people are worried that this registration system is going to end up having an adverse impact on either privacy or anonymity, the more that's going to induce people to register for private accounts rather than public accounts to avoid that registration system. And if you get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people opting for private accounts rather than public accounts, that would really have a chilling effect on free speech. So I think the way to minimize the free speech concerns is to a good job in selling this to the public and explaining to people why actually this system is not a threat to either privacy or anonymity. And if people are persuaded of that, then I think the chilling effect on free speech will be minimal, and I think the First Amendment concerns would then be significantly less. So in conclusion, I just want to say that I've now been talking about these proposals for quite a while to a number of people. And I think one of the main criticisms I'm getting is that I'm proposing what seem to be illiberal policies in order to defend liberal values. I don't think that's true. And the reason I don't think it's true is because I think we need to understand why liberal political philosophy favors free speech. In my understanding of liberal political philosophy, free speech is not an end in itself. Rather, free speech is a means to the end of promoting a healthy democracy. What we've been seeing is a sort of an absolutist version of free speech, actually uh, undermining a healthy democracy, not just in the United States, but also in other democratic countries. We've definitely seen a decline in the quality of democracy in the United States over the past 10 or 15 years. I think social media is part of that. I certainly don't think social media is the main reason for that, but I think it's a part of that. And I think we need to think about intelligent regulation of communication on social media that puts modest limits on free speech on social media for the sake of promoting and protecting a healthy democracy. And in my view, that approach is actually entirely consistent with liberal political values. So let me stop there, and I'm happy now to open it up for comments and questions.